The ocean has a top predator. It is not the great white shark. It is not the sperm whale. It is not anything with a fearsome reputation built on centuries of sailor stories and Hollywood films. The animal at the top of every marine food chain on Earth, in every ocean, in every latitude from the tropics to the poles, is the orca. And the reason it holds that position is not simply because it is large, though it is large. It is not simply because it is powerful, though it is powerful. It is because it is intelligent in a way that no other ocean animal comes close to, and because that intelligence has produced a range of behaviors so sophisticated, so varied, and in some cases so deliberately brutal, that the scientists who study orcas most closely have spent decades trying to find the right language to describe what they are actually watching. Tonight we start at the beginning. Before the hunting tactics, before the brutality, before the behaviors that have made marine biologists question what they thought they knew about the cognitive ceiling of non-human animals, we need to understand what an orca actually is, because most people think they know, and most people are significantly underinformed. Subscribe right now if you have not already, and drop a comment telling us where in the world you are and what time it is there. We read them all and we love knowing where these videos reach. The orca is a dolphin, not metaphorically, not in the loose way that people sometimes group animals into families without thinking carefully about what the grouping means. Literally a dolphin, the largest member of the family Delphinidae, which includes bottlenose dolphins, common dolphins, pilot whales, and about 40 other species. The name killer whale is a mistranslation of a Spanish term, balena asesina, which early sailors used for these animals after watching them attack whales, and the name stuck in a way that has misled people ever since about what kind of animal they are actually dealing with. The orca is not a whale. It is a dolphin that happens to be the size of a bus, and that has, over millions of years of evolution, developed the cognitive and physical toolkit of the ocean's apex predator. The physical reality of an adult male orca is worth sitting with for a moment. He can reach 9 meters in length. He can weigh over 6,000 kilograms. His dorsal fin, the tall blade of black that cuts through the surface and that makes orcas instantly recognizable at distance, can reach almost 2 meters in height, taller than most humans. His jaws contain around 50 teeth, each one conical and interlocking, designed not for chewing but for gripping and tearing, each tooth capable of exerting several tons of force per square centimeter. He can sprint at speeds approaching 50 kilometers per hour. In the water, where the orca's streamlined body works with a hydrodynamic efficiency that land animals cannot approach, this is not a sprint that lasts for seconds. It is a pursuit capability that has evolved in arms race with every fast animal in the ocean, and that has won consistently. The female is smaller, but not dramatically so. She runs between 5 and 7 meters and can weigh up to 4,000 kilograms, which still makes her significantly larger than any land predator currently alive. What the female has that the male does not have to the same degree is longevity. Female orcas can live for over 100 years. This is one of the most remarkable facts in marine biology, and one of the most important for understanding why orcas are what they are. A 100-year-old female orca has been accumulating knowledge about the ocean, about prey behavior, about seasonal patterns, about the behavior of other orca groups for a century. She has survived things that killed other animals. She has learned from everything she has survived. And she is still alive, still the center of her family group, still the animal that her children and her grandchildren, and in some cases, her great-grandchildren orient toward when a decision needs to be made. The orca brain is large. This requires some context to understand properly, because brain size alone is not a reliable indicator of cognitive capability across species. What matters is brain size relative to body size, and beyond that, the internal organization of the brain, which reflects what the brain was shaped by evolution to do. On the first measure, the orca scores well but not remarkably by primate standards. On the second measure, the orca's brain contains something that very few other species' brains contain, a region that neuroscientists have identified as a paralimbic lobe, an extension of the limbic system that is involved in emotional processing and social bonding, and that in the orca is developed to a degree that exceeds even humans. This region is larger, more complex, and more elaborated in the orca than in any other animal on Earth. What this tells us about what orcas experience subjectively, what they feel, what their emotional lives are like, is a question that science is careful about answering directly. What it tells us about the social and emotional complexity of orca life is significant, and is one of the reasons that researchers who study orca behavior keep running into things that their frameworks for understanding animal cognition were not built to handle. The social structure of orcas is built around the mother, not in the way that many social animals are organized around females, where the females are the stable core of the group, while males come and go. In the orca's case, the organization is more total than that. Adult male orcas stay with their mothers for their entire lives. They do not leave the group to form their own. They do not compete for leadership of other groups. They do not disperse in the way that male animals in most species disperse. They stay. An adult male orca swimming in the ocean is almost always swimming with his mother, or within the range of his mother's group, or returning to his mother after a temporary separation. The male orca that has lost his mother is in a fundamentally different and more precarious situation than the one that still has her. And the research on what happens to motherless males is one of the darker stories in orca biology, which we will get to. The family unit is called a matriline, and it consists of a mother, her adult sons and daughters, and the calves of those daughters. Matrilines that share a common ancestor and that associate regularly form pods, and pods that share dialects and social traditions form communities. At the broadest level of social organization, orca populations are divided into what researchers call ecotypes, distinct groups that have been geographically and socially separated long enough to have developed different physical characteristics, different dietary preferences, different hunting strategies, and different cultures. The word culture applied to an animal was once controversial enough in scientific circles to require lengthy justification before it could be used in a peer-reviewed paper. In the orca literature, it is now used routinely, because the behaviors that distinguish one orca population from another check all the criteria that cultural transmission requires. They are learned rather than instinctive. They are transmitted socially from one generation to the next. They vary between groups in ways that are not explained by genetic or environmental differences, and they are maintained with enough consistency across time to constitute a tradition. The dialects are one of the clearest expressions of orca culture. Each pod has a repertoire of calls that is distinct from the repertoire of other pods. The calls are not random vocalizations. They are structured, patterned sounds that carry information about identity and group membership, and they are learned. A young orca born into a pod does not produce that pod's calls instinctively. It learns them over years of exposure and practice in the way that a human child learns a language. The process is gradual, and it involves something that looks like active teaching, older animals producing calls and younger animals approximating them and being corrected or at least responded to differently, depending on how close the approximation is. Pods that share calls belong to the same dialect group. Pods from different communities can be distinguished by the structure of their calls alone without any visual contact. The ocean, for orcas, is full of voices that carry meaning to those equipped to read them, and the reading is not instinct. It is acquired knowledge, passed from one generation to the next through the kind of active social transmission that defines cultural learning. The question of what orcas learn and how they learn it has produced some of the most striking research in animal cognition of the last 2 decades. Orcas have been documented learning new behaviors from a single observation, not through repeated trial and error, but through watching once and reproducing the behavior accurately. They have been documented teaching behaviors to their young through a process that looks, more than anything else in the non-human animal world, like deliberate instruction, not just allowing young animals to observe and copy, but actively facilitating their practice and correcting their errors. And they have been documented acquiring behaviors that are not part of their native cultural repertoire, sometimes from members of other pods, and sometimes, in the most striking cases, from humans. An orca named Luna, who was separated from his pod as a calf and spent years living in a coastal inlet in Canada without other orcas, developed a repertoire of social behaviors directed at humans and at human boats that he had invented from scratch to meet his social needs in the absence of conspecifics. He learned to solicit interaction from boats in ways that became increasingly sophisticated over time, adapting his approach based on what produced responses. He was, in the absence of other orcas to learn from, doing what orca intelligence does when the social environment it is built for is not present, improvising. The intelligence did not disappear because the social context was missing. It redirected itself at whatever was available. Luna is a cautionary story for other reasons, one that we will return to, but as an illustration of the range and the flexibility of what orca intelligence produces, it is among the most striking in the literature. The orca's lifespan, combined with its social structure and its capacity for cultural transmission, produces something that has no real parallel in the ocean. It produces accumulated knowledge across generations. The 100-year-old matriarch has information about the ocean, about prey locations, about the behavior of other animal species, about seasonal and decadal cycles that no other member of her group has. When she moves in a particular direction, the group follows, and the group follows because over the lifetimes of its adult members, the old female has consistently led them toward good things. Her authority is not enforced by physical dominance. It is earned through a track record that the other members of the group have observed across their own lives. The oldest female in an orca group is the group's most valuable cognitive resource, and the loss of a matriarch is measurably costly to the group's performance in the years that follow, in the same way, and for many of the same reasons, that the loss of an elephant matriarch is costly to an elephant family group. The ecotypes that different orca populations represent are one of the most striking examples of rapid cultural and ecological divergence in any species. In the northeastern Pacific alone, researchers have identified at least 3 distinct ecotypes: residents, transients, and offshores. Resident orcas eat almost exclusively fish, primarily salmon, and are among the most studied animals on Earth, thanks to decades of research in the waters of British Columbia and Washington State. Transient orcas, also called Biggs orcas, after the researcher who first documented their distinctness, eat marine mammals and nothing else. They do not eat fish. Offer a transient orca salmon and it will ignore it. Offshore orcas live far from the coast and eat primarily sharks, wearing their teeth down to near nothing, grinding through shark skin. These 3 groups share the same waters, overlap in range, and are genetically close enough to interbreed. They do not interbreed. They do not associate socially. They do not share calls or cultural behaviors. They are, for all practical purposes, different cultures occupying the same geographic space while remaining socially and behaviorally distinct, separated not by geography, but by the traditions they were born into. The calls that orcas produce fall into several categories, and the distinction between them matters for understanding what orca communication actually is. Clicks are used for echolocation, the biological sonar that allows orcas to navigate and locate prey in conditions where vision is limited. Whistles appear to function in close-range social communication, associated with specific social contexts and with specific individuals, in ways that suggest they carry identity information. And discrete calls, the structured vocalizations that form the pod's dialect, appear to function as long-range social signals, announcing group membership and location to other orcas over distances of kilometers. The discrete calls are the ones that are inherited culturally, that differ between pods, and that young orcas spend years learning to produce accurately. The sophistication of this communication system is difficult to overstate. Researchers who have spent decades analyzing orca vocalizations describe it as a system with properties that place it among the most complex animal communication systems known, with a structural richness that may contain more information than we currently know how to decode. What female orcas go through in producing and raising offspring is one of the most demanding reproductive investments in the animal kingdom. The gestation period is 17 months. Calves are born tail first into cold water and must be supported to the surface for their first breath within seconds. The mother nurses the calf for years, producing milk that is among the richest of any marine mammal, and during this period, her own condition matters enormously to the calf's survival. Female orcas in poor condition produce calves that are less likely to survive their first year, and the cost of reproduction is high enough that successful female orcas in wild populations may have as few as 5 calves across their entire lifetime, even those lifetimes that extend past 60 years. This is an extraordinarily low reproductive rate for an animal of this size. It means that every calf represents an enormous investment, and that the loss of any calf is a significant setback to the mother's lifetime reproductive success. The care that mothers invest in calves, and that continues long after the nursing period ends, through years of teaching hunting techniques and cultural knowledge, is a direct reflection of this investment. The relationship between an orca mother and her adult son is one of the most unusual in the animal world, and one of the most studied in orca research. Adult male orcas are formidable animals. They are the largest dolphins on Earth. They have significant physical capabilities, and they are perfectly capable of acquiring food on their own. Yet they remain with their mothers throughout their adult lives. And the data on what this relationship produces is striking. Males whose mothers are still alive are significantly more likely to survive from one year to the next than males whose mothers have died. This effect holds for males of all ages, including males in their 30s and 40s. The mother is providing something to her adult son that he cannot provide for himself, whether it is a preferential share of food, social protection within the group, or navigational and ecological knowledge that helps him locate prey more efficiently. The researchers who documented this found it remarkable enough to write about extensively because the pattern it implies, that adult males in this species are in some functional sense dependent on their mothers throughout their lives, runs counter to the expected pattern for large-bodied male mammals in almost every other species. The play behavior of orcas is worth noting because it adds a dimension to the picture that the predator framing can obscure. Orcas play. They play as calves, which is expected in intelligent social mammals. They also play as adults, which is less expected and more revealing. Adult orcas have been observed surfing waves repeatedly, with no apparent purpose beyond the experience of riding them. They have been observed throwing prey animals into the air and catching them without eating them. They have been observed engaging in social play with each other and occasionally with other species, including interactions with humans in boats that the humans clearly experienced as playful. Play in adult animals is generally interpreted as a sign of cognitive surplus, a brain that has enough capacity beyond what immediate survival demands to engage in activity that is rewarding in itself rather than instrumentally useful. The orca's play life is consistent with the picture of a cognitively rich animal that experiences something like boredom when understimulated and something like enjoyment when engaged in activities it finds rewarding. The sensory world that orcas inhabit is radically different from our own, and understanding it is part of understanding what their intelligence is actually processing. The echolocation system that orcas use for navigation and prey detection produces a three-dimensional acoustic image of the environment around them with a resolution that in some respects exceeds what human vision produces in a comparable space. An orca can detect a fish the size of a human hand at distances of over 100 meters, through complete darkness, through turbid water, through schools of other fish. The returning echoes are processed in a way that produces detailed information about the size, shape, texture, and movement of whatever is reflecting them. This is not passive detection, it is active sensing, the orca emitting pulses of sound and reading the returning information with a sophistication that researchers are still working to fully understand. The social dimension of echolocation adds another layer. Orca group members can hear each other's echolocation clicks and the returning echoes, meaning that information gathered by one animal's active sonar may be available to others in the group. Hunting in a group of animals that can all hear what each other's sonar is picking up produces a collective sensory picture of the environment that no single animal could generate alone. The question of what orcas know about themselves has been examined through mirror self-recognition studies conducted with captive animals, and the results are positive. Orcas recognize themselves in mirrors. They use mirrors to examine parts of their own bodies, and they show the behavioral markers that researchers use to distinguish genuine self-recognition from simple social response to a reflection. The number of animal species that have demonstrated mirror self-recognition is small enough to be listed on a single page, And every animal on that list, great apes, dolphins, elephants, some corvids, orcas, shares the characteristic of being a long-lived, highly social animal with a complex brain organized around social relationships. The mirror test does not tell us what orcas think about themselves. It tells us that they have a concept of self that is distinct enough from the world around them to be recognizable in a reflection, and that concept is one of the cognitive foundations on which everything else in this story rests. The orca entered the ocean somewhere between 10 and 15 million years ago in the Miocene epoch from a lineage of small-toothed whales that were themselves descendants of land mammals that had returned to the water roughly 50 million years before that. In evolutionary terms, the orca's dominance of the ocean is recent. In absolute terms, 10 to 15 million years is enough time to produce, through the accumulation of small advantages and the elimination of strategies that did not work, the most cognitively sophisticated predator the ocean has ever contained. What that predator does with its intelligence when it hunts is what the next part is about. It is not a comfortable story, but it is one of the most impressive things that the natural world has produced, and it deserves to be told in full. The geographic range of orcas is another data point that the intelligence argument depends on. Orcas are found in every ocean on Earth. They live in the waters of Antarctica, where temperatures drop low enough to kill most marine life quickly. They live in tropical waters near the equator. They are found in the North Atlantic, the North Pacific, the Southern Ocean, the Indian Ocean, the Mediterranean. No other apex predator has this global range. The great white shark comes close but is absent from polar waters. The sperm whale is widespread, but is not the apex predator of every system it occupies. The orca is the apex predator of every system it occupies, everywhere it goes, at every latitude. This is not an accident of size or of weapons. It is a consequence of the orca's ability to develop locally appropriate hunting strategies and transmit them culturally, so that each population is optimized for its own environment, while the underlying cognitive architecture remains constant. The intelligence scales. The culture adapts it. The result is an animal that is at the top of the food chain everywhere on Earth that has an ocean. The orca's position relative to other apex predators it shares the ocean with tells us something about what the combination of physical capability and intelligence produces at the extreme end. Great white sharks, which are among the most formidable predators in evolutionary history, avoid orcas, not cautiously, not occasionally, but absolutely. Research off the coast of California found that the presence of a pair of transient orcas in the area caused great white sharks to leave the region immediately and not return for the rest of the season. The sharks detected the presence of orcas, assessed the situation, and made a decision that involved abandoning a rich feeding ground and relocating far away. Whatever the shark knows about orcas, it is enough to make the largest predatory fish on Earth decide that the right response to their presence is to leave entirely. Sperm whales, which can reach lengths of 18 meters and which carry in their jaws an array of conical teeth designed to handle giant squid, have been documented fleeing from orca groups that attack them. The animals that orcas sometimes choose to kill are not the small and vulnerable. They are the most powerful things in the ocean, and they lose. What this first part has been building toward is a specific picture, an animal of extraordinary physical capability, organized into culturally distinct groups with inherited behavioral traditions, capable of learning from observation and of teaching actively with a social structure built around the long-lived female, with dialects that distinguish populations the way languages distinguish human communities, with a sensory world of extraordinary richness, and with a brain that contains a region for emotional and social processing more elaborate than any other animal on Earth. That is the orca before it hunts. What it is when it hunts is the subject of the next part, and the next part will require setting aside some comfortable assumptions about what animals are capable of planning, executing, and enjoying. The ocean's most intelligent predator is most itself when it is doing what it was built to do. What it was built to do is formidable. The orca's longevity produces a cognitive resource that has no parallel among ocean predators. A female orca that has lived for 60 years has experienced every significant ecological event that occurred in her range across those 6 decades. Shifts in prey populations, changes in migration patterns, the arrival of new threats, the disappearance of old ones. She has survived conditions that killed younger animals. She has found food in years when food was scarce, and all of that experience is retained, available to inform the decisions she makes today, and transmitted to the younger animals in her group through the behavioral choices they observe her making and the outcomes those choices produce. The ocean is not a static environment. It changes across years and across decades in ways that matter enormously to the animals that live in it. An animal that can draw on 6 decades of information about how the ocean changes, and that can pass that information to the next generation, is not just surviving the ocean. It is navigating it with a depth of accumulated knowledge that no animal without a long life and a functioning long-term memory can match. This is why the oldest female in an orca group is the group's most valuable member. Not because she is the most physically capable, because she is the most informed. And in the ocean, information is the difference between eating and not eating, between finding the salmon run and missing it by days. Her knowledge keeps the group alive. Her intelligence, accumulated across decades, is the orca's greatest weapon. The research community that has built up around orca study is itself a reflection of how unusual these animals are as subjects. The Center for Whale Research in Washington State has been tracking the southern resident killer whale population continuously since 1976, making it one of the longest continuous studies of any wild animal population on Earth. The researchers involved no individual animals by name and by the identifying features of their fins and saddle patches. They have followed generations. They have documented births and deaths and social changes and dietary shifts across 5 decades of observation. What that 50-year record has produced is not just a database of facts about a population of orcas. It is a portrait of a community with individual histories and family dynamics and social events. A portrait that no short-term study could have produced and that has changed what researchers think is possible to know about a non-human animal. The orca rewarded that investment of time with a level of complexity that, 50 years in, is still producing surprises. That is the mark of an animal whose intelligence has not yet reached the ceiling of what careful observation can find. The name killer whale captures something real even as it misleads about taxonomy. The orca kills. It kills at the top of every food chain in the ocean. It kills animals much larger than itself. It kills in ways that are, by any reasonable standard, sophisticated enough to require the word plan. And it does all of this with a social coherence that means the kill is rarely, if ever, the act of a single animal operating alone. It is the act of a group, coordinated, culturally informed, drawing on knowledge that was acquired over years and transmitted across generations. That is who the orca is, in the ocean, in its element, at the apex of 4 billion years of evolutionary history that has produced at its pinnacle this animal. The next part goes to where that history arrives, into the water, in the moment before the hunt begins. The grandmother hypothesis, which was developed initially in the context of human evolution to explain why women live long past their reproductive years, has found in orcas one of its most compelling non-human examples. Human grandmothers, the hypothesis proposes, provide enough benefit to their grandchildren through childcare and food sharing, and knowledge transmission to more than compensate for the resources they consume without reproducing. The orca data is consistent with a version of this hypothesis. Post-reproductive female orcas, those who have stopped having calves of their own, provide benefits to their sons and to the calves of their daughters that are measurable in survival outcomes. A salmon-hunting orca group with a post-reproductive matriarch present finds salmon more efficiently than one without her, particularly during years of poor salmon abundance, when the difference between finding the run and missing it is the difference between a fed group and a starving one. What the old female carries in her mind, the accumulated map of where salmon have been found in bad years across her decades of experience, is the group's most valuable navigational tool. She is not consuming resources, she is generating survival. The orca's relationship to grief is documented in ways that parallel what has been observed in elephants and in chimpanzees, and in some cases goes beyond what has been observed in either. A female orca in the Salish Sea was observed carrying her dead calf at the surface for 17 days across over 1,000 miles of ocean, not releasing the body, not returning to the normal behaviors of her group. The research community that had been tracking this population for decades watched this happen and wrote about it with the careful language that science requires, noting the behavioral observations and their duration, avoiding the word grief in the published papers while using it quietly in conversation. Whether what was happening inside the orca could be called grief in any sense that maps onto human grief is a philosophical question that the science cannot resolve. What happened at the surface of the ocean, 17 days and 1,000 miles, is not a philosophical question. It is a fact. And it is one of the facts about orcas that stays with you after everything else from this first part has been absorbed. The hunt begins before the prey knows it has started. That is the first thing to understand about how orcas kill. The tactics are not reactive. They are not the ambush of a shark or the pursuit of a cheetah, responses to an opportunity that presented itself. They are planned, in the sense that a sequence of coordinated actions is initiated before the prey has been contacted, that roles are distributed among group members, and that the execution follows a pattern that has been observed repeatedly across decades of field research. Whether this constitutes planning in the full cognitive sense that the word implies when applied to humans is a question that researchers debate carefully. What is not debatable is what the behavior looks like, and what it looks like is this: a group of animals approaching a problem they have solved before, applying a solution they have used before, distributing the work among themselves in ways that maximize the probability of success, and executing that solution with a precision that leaves almost no margin for the prey to escape. Subscribe right now if you have not already, and drop a comment telling us where you are in the world and what time it is there. Those comments help more than you know. The carousel feeding technique, used by certain orca populations in Norway to hunt herring, is one of the clearest examples of coordinated hunting strategy in any non-human animal. Herring are fast, numerous, and capable of producing collective evasive behaviors that make it difficult for a single predator to isolate and catch individual fish. The orca's response to this problem is not to chase individual fish. It is to reorganize the school. A group of orcas begins moving in a coordinated circular pattern around the school of herring, tightening the circle gradually while producing bubble curtains, clouds of exhaled air that rise through the water, and that herring, which are light-sensitive and respond to visual stimuli at the boundaries of their school, treat as a barrier they will not cross. The school compresses. As it compresses, individual fish begin to break from the edges. At this point, individual orcas dart through the school, using their tail flukes to slap the surface of the densely packed fish and stun them, then consuming the stunned individuals at leisure. The technique requires that multiple animals maintain the circular pattern while others make their feeding runs, that the bubble curtains be produced consistently enough to hold the school together, and that the whole operation be sustained long enough for everyone in the group to feed. It is a solution to a problem that required understanding the behavior of the prey, coordinating multiple actors around a shared objective, and sustaining that coordination across the duration of a feeding event that can last for hours. The wave washing technique, used by Antarctic orca populations to hunt Weddell seals resting on ice floes, operates on a completely different principle and is arguably the most dramatic coordinated hunting behavior documented in any marine animal. The seal on the ice is relatively safe. The ice floe is large enough and stable enough that the orca cannot simply reach up and take it, and the seal knows this, which is why it chose the ice floe in the first place. The orcas know that the seal knows this, and they have developed a response to exactly this situation that does not involve a direct physical confrontation with the ice. The group submerges and swims in formation toward the ice floe, surfacing on the far side and then diving simultaneously to create a wave large enough to wash over the ice and either knock the seal into the water or destabilize the flow enough that the seal loses its footing and slides off. If the first wave does not succeed, the group repeats the maneuver and repeats it. There are documented cases of orca groups executing this technique more than 24 times against a single seal on a single floe before either the seal was dislodged or the orcas gave up. The persistence and the repetition of a technique that produces no immediate payoff is consistent with an animal that understands the causal chain well enough to continue investing effort in a strategy that is not yet working, but that has worked before. What makes the wave-washing behavior even more striking is what happens when it succeeds. If the seal is washed into the water, the orcas do not immediately kill it. In many documented cases, they play with it. They throw it. They bat it with their flukes. They let it surface and then submerge it again. They perform behaviors that, from the outside, look unmistakably like what they are, which is the behavior of animals that are not simply consuming a resource, but are engaging with the activity of hunting in a way that suggests something beyond hunger is being satisfied. Researchers avoid the word enjoyment in their papers. They describe the behavior as object play directed at prey items, which is accurate, and is also a carefully constructed way of saying something that the footage of the behavior makes unavoidable. The orcas appear to be having fun. The distinction between playing with prey before killing it and enjoying the hunt is one that the science maintains cautiously. The footage does not maintain it easily. The techniques that different orca populations have developed for dealing with large whales represent the most physically demanding and arguably the most cognitively impressive hunting behavior the species exhibits. Blue whales, the largest animals that have ever existed on Earth, reaching 30 meters in length and weighing as much as 200 tons, are killed by orcas, not frequently, not easily, but killed. The methods documented in the footage that has accumulated over the past 2 decades involve large groups of transient orcas working together over periods that can extend for hours, targeting the blue whale's flippers to restrict its ability to maneuver, working in relay so that individual orcas can rest while others maintain contact with the whale, and ultimately exhausting the whale to the point where access to its mouth and its tongue, which is rich in fat and calories, becomes possible. The caloric investment in a successful attack on a blue whale is enormous, and the payoff is correspondingly large. But the logistics of coordinating an attack on a 30-meter animal that is actively trying to escape, across an event that lasts for hours, and distributing the effort across group members so that the attack can be sustained, exceeds what most models of animal group behavior were built to accommodate. Humpback whales present a different challenge and a different orca response. Humpbacks are not passive prey. A humpback cow with a calf is one of the most aggressive large animals in the ocean when her calf is threatened. She will use her 40-foot body as a weapon, charging orcas directly, attempting to shield her calf with her own body, producing the powerful sounds that humpbacks use to communicate distress, which in some cases attracts other humpbacks to assist in the defense. Documented orca attacks on humpback calves involve tactics specifically designed to counter these defenses, separating the calf from the cow through coordinated maneuvers that exploit the speed differential between the two, driving the calf toward deeper water, where the cow's ability to shield it is reduced, and targeting the calf's blowhole to restrict its breathing when direct contact is established. These are not generalized attack patterns applied to a new target. They are responses to the specific defensive behaviors of a specific prey species, implying that the orcas involved have enough information about humpback behavior to anticipate the defenses and plan around them. The beaching behavior used by certain orca populations on the Patagonian coast to hunt sea lion pups represents one of the most visually dramatic hunting techniques in the ocean world, and one of the most culturally transmitted. Orcas in this population deliberately strand themselves on beaches to grab sea lion pups from the surf zone, a behavior that carries real physical risk. An orca stranded on a beach that cannot get back into the water will die. The behavior requires precise judgment about wave patterns, beach topography, and the timing of the approach relative to both the position of the prey and the receding water that will carry the orca back off the beach. Young orcas in this population learn the behavior from adults through a process that has been documented on film in striking detail. The adult approaches the beach, strands briefly, takes a pup, recovers to the water. A younger animal watches. On subsequent attempts, the younger animal begins approaching the beach itself, tentatively, not quite committing, while the adult repeats the maneuver nearby. Over seasons, the young animal's technique improves. The beach behavior is taught, and it is taught in the one way that a behavior requiring precise, real-time judgment about a dangerous physical environment can be taught, which is through repeated demonstration and patient-supervised practice. The transmission of hunting techniques from one generation to the next has been documented in enough detail to settle, for most researchers, the question of whether orca hunting behavior is instinctive or learned. The answer is learned, and the learning is cultural. When orca calves are born, they do not know how to hunt. They learn by observation and by practice, alongside adults who tolerate and facilitate their development in the way that teachers tolerate and facilitate the development of students who do not yet know what they are doing. The young orca that participates in a carousel feeding event for the first time is not an equal contributor to the hunt. It is watching, following, attempting to participate without disrupting the coordination of the experienced animals, and occasionally being corrected by those animals when its positioning threatens to break up the pattern the group is trying to maintain. Over seasons and years, the young animal's role in the hunt shifts from observer to contributor to full participant. The technique is acquired incrementally through the kind of extended apprenticeship that complex skills in any domain require. The acoustic dimension of orca hunting adds a layer that is easy to miss if you are watching the footage without listening to it. Hunting orcas produce vocalizations that are different from the vocalizations they produce during social interaction, and the differences are not random. Different call types appear in different phases of a hunt, and experienced animals in a group appear to coordinate their movements based on acoustic cues from other group members. The echolocation clicks used to locate prey carry information that is audible to other orcas nearby, meaning that the sensory picture one animal is building of the prey's position, and movement is partially available to others. The group hunting orca is not just a collection of individuals pursuing a shared target. It is a distributed sensory system, with multiple animals contributing information to a shared understanding of what the prey is doing and where it is going. The precision with which orca groups anticipate prey movement during cooperative hunts suggests that the coordination is based on real-time information sharing at a level that the research is still working to fully describe. The gray whale migration corridor off the coast of California and Baja presents transient orcas with a predictable annual prey opportunity that they exploit with a consistency and a sophistication that the research has been documenting for decades. Gray whale cows with calves travel northward along the coast each spring, and the calves, which were born only weeks earlier and have not yet developed the strength or the navigational knowledge to evade sustained pursuit, are targeted by transient orca groups that position themselves along the migration route in anticipation. The positioning itself is informative. The orcas are not following the whales. They are waiting where the whales will be, based on knowledge of the migration timing and route that is accurate enough to allow them to be in the right place before the whales arrive. Once the whales are encountered, the attack on the calf follows the pattern that multiple research groups have documented independently, driving the calf away from its mother, preventing the cow from shielding the calf with her body, and targeting the calf's blowhole to restrict its breathing. The cow's response, and the cow's response is vigorous and determined, is anticipated and countered. The hunt is not a reaction. It is a plan meeting a defense, and the plan wins more often than the defense does. The prey spectrum of orcas, taken as a whole, is one of the most diverse of any predator on Earth. Different ecotypes eat different things, and within ecotypes, different populations have developed preferences and techniques that reflect the prey available in their range. Resident orcas in the Northeast Pacific eat Chinook salmon almost exclusively when Chinook are available, and the caloric density of Chinook relative to other salmon species means that the residents have become specialists calibrated to a single prey type. Transient orcas eat marine mammals ranging from sea lions and dolphins to minke whales and gray whales. Offshore orcas eat sharks, including species that are themselves apex predators. Norwegian orcas specialize in herring. New Zealand orcas have been documented eating rays and sharks. Antarctic orcas eat seals using the wave washing technique, and also eat minke and humpback whales using the exhaustion and drowning method. The common thread across all of these is not a specific prey type. It is a cognitive architecture flexible enough to develop locally appropriate hunting strategies and transmit them culturally, producing a different predatory specialist in each ocean environment while the underlying intelligence remains constant. The speed at which orcas adapt their hunting techniques to new conditions is one of the more unsettling aspects of their predatory intelligence. When the population of Chinook salmon in the Pacific Northwest declined in the late 20th century, the resident orca populations that depended on them showed measurable declines in body condition and reproductive success. But what they did not do was simply fail. Researchers observed individuals attempting to expand their prey base to include other fish species, testing techniques that were not part of their cultural repertoire, and in some cases succeeding at capturing prey they had not historically hunted. The adaptation was partial, insufficient to compensate for the Chinook decline, and the resident population continued to struggle. But the attempt itself, the reaching for new solutions in response to a changing environment, was there. The intelligence that builds sophisticated hunting strategies is the same intelligence that tries to adapt those strategies when circumstances change. The orca does not simply apply a fixed program, it runs a flexible one. The relationship between orca hunting and play is one that researchers have noted repeatedly without being entirely comfortable with what it implies. The line between playing with prey and hunting it is not always clear in orca behavior. Young orcas spend time in behaviors that look like hunt practice, chasing objects that are not food, performing maneuvers on fish they have already caught and do not appear to be eating. Adults engage in what looks like predatory behavior, directed at animals they do not consume, chasing dolphins without catching them, approaching sea lions and veering away at the last moment. One interpretation is that these behaviors are simply mistakes or misfires of predatory programming. Another interpretation, which the sophistication of orca behavior in other domains makes harder to dismiss, is that the orca is practicing, maintaining and refining skills that it will use in actual hunts. The same neural architecture that allows a complex skill to be transmitted culturally requires that the skill be practiced to remain sharp. Practice and play are not always distinguishable from the outside, and in the orca the evidence suggests they may not always be distinguishable from the inside either. The encounter between orcas and dolphins is documented in footage that is difficult to categorize cleanly as either predation or something else. Transient orcas, which eat marine mammals, do prey on dolphins. Resident orcas, which eat fish, have been documented in what look like play interactions with dolphins, chasing them in ways that do not result in injury or consumption. The dolphin populations in areas with resident orca activity seem to know the difference. They respond to transient orcas with immediate flight and alarm. They respond to resident orcas with something closer to indifference or even apparent curiosity, approaching the orca groups and riding the bow waves created by large orcas moving through the water. The dolphins are reading the orcas. They are making a distinction between a killer and a non-killer based on behavioral or acoustic cues that the research is still working to identify, and the orcas, for their part, maintain this distinction in practice. Resident orcas that encounter dolphins do not attack them. The dietary specialization that cultural transmission has locked each ecotype into is maintained even when the opportunity to breach it is present. The orca that does not eat dolphins is in the presence of dolphins and does not eat them. That is not instinct. That is a learned rule, applied consistently, in the presence of an opportunity the animal's physical capabilities would allow it to take. The liver extraction behavior documented off the coast of South Africa added a dimension to the orca hunting picture that researchers found genuinely surprising. White sharks in this region were found dead, with their livers surgically removed, the rest of the body intact. Eventually, researchers were able to document what was happening. Orcas had learned to invert sharks, inducing a state of tonic immobility, the involuntary stillness that sharks enter when held upside down, and then to open the body cavity and extract the liver with a precision that left the surrounding tissue largely undamaged. The shark liver is one of the most calorie-dense organs in any marine animal, rich in fat and in a compound called squalene that the sharks use to regulate buoyancy. The orcas had identified the most valuable part of a large predator and developed a technique for accessing it efficiently while leaving the less caloric remainder behind. This is not scavenging. This is targeted resource extraction from a live prey animal, using a behavioral technique that exploits the shark's own neurological quirks to make the extraction possible. The researchers who documented it described it as one of the most sophisticated predatory behaviors they had encountered in 3 decades of fieldwork. The orca's handling of prey after the kill provides another window into the cognitive dimension of what is happening. In documented hunts involving large whale calves, the orca group does not simply kill the calf and divide the food. There is a sequence of behaviors following the kill that varies systematically by age and role of the individuals involved. The older, more experienced animals feed first and on the most calorie-rich portions. Younger animals feed later or on less preferred portions. Mothers have been observed directing their calves to portions of the prey that are appropriate for calves to consume. The distribution of food is not random. It is organized, and the organization reflects the social hierarchy of the group and the different nutritional needs of its members. What this means is that the orca group is not simply a collection of individuals hunting together for individual benefit. It is a social unit that produces collective outcomes and distributes those outcomes in ways that reflect group membership and relative status. That is a level of social organization that, in the context of a hunt, requires that individuals track not just the prey but each other, and that they calibrate their own feeding behavior to what others are doing and to what their position in the group entitles them to. The encounters between orca groups and human boats that have been escalating in frequency off the coasts of Spain and Portugal since 2020 have added a new dimension to the orca behavior literature that is still being interpreted. Orca groups in this region have been approaching sailboats, grabbing their rudders, and in some cases disabling the boats by breaking the rudders off. The behavior began appearing suddenly, spread through the local population over a period of months, and has now been documented in dozens of encounters. The explanations proposed by researchers range from play behavior to social fad to a traumatized individual's defensive response that was imitated by other group members. What is clear is that the behavior is learned, is spreading through the population through social transmission, and is being performed by animals that are capable of distinguishing between different types of boats, and that appear to prefer rudders on sailboats over other available contact points on the vessel. Whatever the motivation, the behavior demonstrates once again that orca groups can acquire new behaviors rapidly, propagate them socially across a population, and apply them with enough consistency and enough attention to detail to select preferred targets within the general category of thing they are interacting with. That is not random. That is the orca being the orca, intelligent, culturally connected, and capable of producing behaviors that were not there last year. What the hunting behaviors described in this part have in common, across the carousel feeding and the wave washing and the beaching and the liver extraction and the coordinated attacks on the largest animals on Earth, is a quality that the data keeps pointing toward, and that the word plan, used carefully and with its scientific caveats, is the most accurate word for. These are not reflexive responses to prey stimuli. They are organized, multi-step, coordinated, culturally transmitted solutions to the problem of acquiring specific food in specific environments. They require that the animal doing them understands at some level the causal structure of what it is doing, not in a philosophical sense, in a practical one. The orca that creates a bubble curtain understands at the level of behavior that the bubble curtain will compress the school. The orca that approaches the beach understands, at the level of behavior, that the timing of the wave will determine whether it gets back off. The orca that inverts a shark understands, at the level of behavior, that the inverted shark will not move. These are not happy accidents. They are the output of a mind that has been shaped by evolution and by culture to be very good at a very specific set of problems, and that brings to those problems a level of intelligence that has no peer in the ocean. The next part turns to the side of orca life that the hunting behaviors only begin to reveal. The social dynamics within the group, the cost of captivity, and what happens when the intelligence of the ocean's apex predator is placed in a context that its cognitive needs cannot be met in. That is where the brutality the title promised fully arrives. Not in the hunt, where it is clean and ecological and ancient, but in the situation that humans created with the best intentions and that produced in the orca something that the open ocean never produces. Something that had nowhere else to go. The patience that orca hunting requires is one of its most underappreciated dimensions. The wave-washing sequences that can involve more than 20 attempts against a single seal on a single ice floe represent an investment of time and energy that would be rational only if the animals involved have some model of the expected payoff that sustains the effort across repeated failures. An animal operating purely on immediate reward would abandon the sequence after the first unsuccessful attempt and look for easier prey. The orca does not do this. It repeats the technique, adjusting the angle or the timing or the composition of the wave with each attempt, maintaining the effort across a sequence that can last for 30 minutes or more. This is patience in the service of a goal, sustained across a period of unrewarded effort by something that functions like expectation, the anticipation of a payoff that the experience of previous successful hunts has established as real. Whether this constitutes hope in any meaningful sense is a question the science declines to answer. What the behavior itself shows is an animal with enough cognitive reach across time to keep working toward an outcome that is not yet present. The cooperation between unrelated orca groups that has been documented in some feeding situations adds a dimension that the matrilineal social structure of orcas does not obviously predict. Orca groups are not normally cooperative with each other in the way that members of the same group are cooperative. Different pods can be indifferent to each other or actively tense, particularly when they are competing for the same prey. But in situations involving very large prey or very abundant prey, researchers have observed different pods temporarily coordinating their behavior in ways that increase the collective payoff. The threshold at which cooperation between non-relatives becomes rational is a problem in evolutionary theory with a specific answer. It happens when the gain from cooperating exceeds the individual cost of sharing the outcome, and when the partners in the cooperation are reliable enough to make the arrangement work. The orca's social intelligence, built for tracking the reliability of individuals within the group, appears to extend under the right circumstances to the assessment of individuals in other groups, and to the flexible deployment of cooperative behavior where that assessment supports it. The question of whether orcas experience something like satisfaction after a successful hunt is one that the science approaches carefully, but that the behavioral record makes difficult to set aside entirely. After a large kill, orca groups consistently engage in behaviors that have no immediate functional purpose. Socializing, rubbing against each other, vocalizing at elevated rates, engaging in surface activities like breaching and spy hopping that are energetically expensive and serve no obvious nutritional function. The post-hunt behavior is different from the pre-hunt behavior and from the behavior during a feeding event, and the difference is consistent enough across populations and across research sites to be a real pattern rather than an artifact of specific observations. Whatever internal state these behaviors reflect, the animals are doing something different after a successful hunt than they are doing before it. The most parsimonious description of what that something is, the one that matches the pattern without over-interpreting it, is that the animals are in a different state, and the state they are in looks, from the outside, like the state that follows the successful completion of something that required effort and attention and coordination, and that produced a result the animals were working toward. The orca in the open ocean is the product of 10 to 15 million years of evolutionary refinement applied to the problem of being the top predator in every marine environment on Earth. What the hunting behaviors described in this part represent is not simply a collection of impressive techniques. They represent the expression of an intelligence that has been shaped across that entire span of time to solve the specific problems that hunting in the ocean presents. Prey that is fast, prey that is large, prey that defends itself actively, prey that groups together in ways that resist individual predation. Every technique in the orca's cultural repertoire is an answer to one of these problems, worked out through the trial and error of individual innovation and preserved through the cultural transmission that makes each successful answer available to the next generation. The hunt is where the orca's intelligence is most fully itself, and what it is, in that full expression, is something that no other predator in the history of the ocean has matched. The next part turns to what happens when that intelligence is confined. What captivity does to an animal built for this? The answer is one of the darkest stories in the history of humans and animals, and it is the one we have been building towards since the first part began. One more hunting context deserves mention before we close this part, because it illustrates better than almost any other example the degree to which orca behavior is calibrated not just to the prey, but to the observer. Orcas in the Crozet Islands in the southern Indian Ocean have been documented approaching research stations on the island and performing behaviors near the shore that appear to be directed at the humans watching from the beach. In some cases, the orcas brought prey items, live penguins or fish, to the shallows near the researchers and released them, watching what the researchers did. In other cases, they remained at the surface near the researchers for extended periods in what looked like mutual observation. The researchers watching this documented it carefully, noted that the orcas appeared to be tracking human attention and responding to it, and that the behavior was consistent with the orcas treating the researchers as social entities worthy of attention, rather than simply as features of the environment. Whether this constitutes intentional communication is a question the science leaves open. What it shows, at minimum, is an animal that is aware of being watched, that has a model of the watcher as a social presence, and that modulates its behavior in response to that presence. That is the orca. Intelligent, socially complex, and even in the context of the hunt, interested in what is watching it. The first orca was captured for display in 1964. A sculptor hired to create a life-size model harpooned a female off the coast of British Columbia, expecting her to die so he could measure her body. She did not die. She was towed to Vancouver Aquarium and placed in a tank, and the public response to her presence was large enough that the aquarium kept her alive and began displaying her. She was given the name Moby Doll. She lived for 87 days and died from the stress of confinement and from an infection caused by the antifungal agents added to her tank water. She ate almost nothing during those 87 days, vocalized constantly, and spent much of her time motionless at the surface in the attitude that researchers now recognize as a behavioral marker of severe psychological distress in captive orcas. In the decades that followed, the capture industry grew rapidly, driven by the commercial success of marine parks that discovered what Vancouver Aquarium had discovered, that people would pay to see a live orca. The captures moved from incidental to systematic. Entire pods were surrounded by speedboats and nets in Puget Sound, with calves separated from their mothers and loaded onto transport vessels, while the adult animals circled the nets, vocalizing, attempting to reach the calves that had been taken from them. The sounds the adults produced during these separations were recorded by researchers who later described them as the most distressing animal vocalizations they had ever heard. The industry that produced them described them as necessary for conservation education. Subscribe before we go any further. Drop a comment right now telling us where you are in the world and what time it is there. We want to know. What captivity does to an orca begins with the space. An orca in the wild ranges over hundreds of kilometers in a single day. It navigates by echolocation in open water, where the returning signals contain information about the environment in all directions simultaneously. In a concrete tank, the echolocation signals return from the tank walls constantly, from every direction, producing an acoustic environment that researchers who have tried to model it describe as something like living inside a hall of mirrors made of sound. The orca cannot turn off its echolocation. It cannot stop producing clicks and receiving the returns. It cannot adapt to a tank in the way it might adapt to a new stretch of ocean, because the tank is not a different version of the ocean. It is a fundamentally different sensory environment that the orca's perceptual system was not built to inhabit. The social deprivation follows. Orcas in the wild live in matrilineal groups whose members they have known since birth, in a social world that is continuous, familiar, and organized around relationships that have accumulated history across years. In captivity, they are housed with animals from different populations, different ecotypes, sometimes different regions of the world, animals whose dialects they cannot speak and whose cultural traditions they do not share. The social landscape they were built to navigate, the one their large paralimbic lobe was shaped by evolution to process, is replaced by one that is not just different, but genuinely foreign. Documented aggressive interactions between captive orcas from incompatible populations are frequent, sometimes severe, and in some cases fatal. The aggression is not random. It reflects the tension of animals whose social needs cannot be met in the social environment they have been placed in. The dorsal fin collapse, that is characteristic of male orcas in captivity, and that is not seen in wild orca populations except in specific rare conditions, is one of the most visible signs of what confinement does to the animal's physiology. The dorsal fin of a wild adult male orca, which can reach 2 meters in height, is maintained upright by the internal pressure of a healthy animal that moves constantly and in 3 dimensions, that dives to depths that create the hydrostatic conditions in which the fin's connective tissue is maintained. In a shallow tank, where deep diving is not possible, and where the animal spends significant time at the surface, the fin droops. Not because the animal is ill, though captive orcas are frequently ill, because the physical conditions that maintain the fin in its functional state no longer exist. The dorsal fin collapse is not a cosmetic issue. It is a structural index of what the captive environment is and is not providing to an animal, that requires something it cannot be given in a tank. The capture operations in Puget Sound between 1965 and 1973 removed dozens of animals from the southern resident population, a population that at the time numbered around 200 individuals. The removals were not distributed randomly across the population. Calves and juveniles were preferentially selected because they were easier to transport, and because they were the animals most likely to survive long enough to be commercially useful. The demographic impact of removing young animals preferentially from a population with an already slow reproductive rate was exactly what population biology would predict: a reduction in the number of animals that would have reached breeding age, a reduction in the number of calves those animals would have produced, and a long-term suppression of population growth that persisted for decades after the captures ended. The southern resident population that was being studied by the Center for Whale Research in the years following the capture era never fully recovered. It is currently classified as critically endangered, with approximately 75 individuals remaining. The capture industry that reduced it did not cause this alone. Declining Chinook salmon abundance was a major contributing factor, but the captures removed animals that the population needed and did not replace them, and the population is still paying for that. The specific experience of an orca calf being separated from its mother during a capture operation is worth dwelling on for a moment, because the first part of this series established what the mother-calf bond means in this species. A female orca nurses her calf for years. The calf is in constant proximity to the mother for the first several years of life. The mother is not just the calf's food source. She is its entire social world, the source of its cultural education, the model from which it learns what it means to be an orca in the specific ocean it was born into. The separation of a calf from its mother, when it happened during the capture operations, was not the separation of a young animal from a caregiver who could be replaced by another caregiver. It was the severing of a relationship that was the calf's entire universe, in a way that had no parallel in the calf's experience and no framework in its behavioral repertoire for how to process what was happening. The sounds the adult animals made circling the nets while the calves were loaded were documented. The sounds the calves made were not described in any of the contemporaneous accounts, which is a silence that says something about what the people present chose not to record. The case of Keiko, the orca who played Willie in the 1993 film Free Willy, introduced a new dimension to the captivity story when the film's success generated public pressure to actually free the orca who had performed in it. Keiko was living at an amusement park in Mexico City in a tank too small for him, with chronic skin lesions and at significantly below normal weight. The campaign to release him raised millions of dollars, transported him to Iceland, and eventually released him into the wild after years of preparation. He was unable to reintegrate into a wild orca group. He followed a fishing boat to Norway and spent the remaining period of his life in a fjord there, seeking human contact, apparently unable to function as a wild orca, and dying in 2003 from pneumonia. The story was used by the captive display industry as evidence that captive orcas cannot be returned to the wild. What it actually demonstrated was that an orca that had spent its formative years in captivity, that had not been raised by a wild mother in a wild pod, that had not learned the cultural knowledge and the behavioral repertoire of a wild orca, could not simply be placed in the ocean and expected to know how to be a wild orca. The captivity had produced an animal that was neither fully captive nor capable of being wild. It had produced something in between, an outcome that the captivity itself created and that could not be undone. The behavior that captive orcas develop over time in response to these conditions has a clinical name in the zoological literature: stereotypy. It refers to repetitive, invariant behaviors that serve no obvious function and that appear in captive animals across many species when the cognitive and physical needs of those animals are not being met. Captive orcas pace the perimeters of their tanks in fixed patterns. They perform the same swimming routes repeatedly, the same turns at the same points for hours. They chew on the metal fixtures of their enclosures, sometimes to the point of wearing their teeth down to nubs. They hang motionless at the surface for long periods. These behaviors are not performances, and they are not play. They are what happens to a brain organized around constant movement, constant novel sensory input, constant social interaction, and constant cognitive engagement when those inputs are removed. The brain does not simply shut down, it produces what it can with what it has. What it produces, in the absence of anything real to engage with, is repetition. The relationship between wild orca populations and the humans who share their ocean is not uniform, and the contrast between the relationship in different cultural contexts is itself informative. Indigenous communities on the northwest coast of North America have lived alongside orcas for thousands of years and have developed cultural traditions around them that reflect a long history of observation and coexistence. In Kwakwaka'wakw and other northwest coast traditions, the orca is a figure of particular importance, associated with power and with the sea's capacity to sustain life. The ecological knowledge embedded in these traditions, knowledge about orca behavior, about their seasonal patterns, about the relationship between orca presence and salmon abundance, accumulated over generations in the way that all traditional ecological knowledge accumulates, through sustained attention to the natural world across long periods. The Western scientific study of orcas, which began seriously only in the 1970s, has in some respects been catching up to what careful long-term observation had already established. And the convergence between scientific findings and traditional ecological knowledge in the orca literature is notable enough that several research groups have explicitly incorporated traditional knowledge into their work. The question of what orcas in captivity know about their situation, whether they have any awareness of what they are missing, or any model of a different existence, is one that science cannot answer directly, and that philosophy handles only with difficulty. What can be said is that the behavioral indicators of chronic psychological distress in captive orcas are consistent and well documented, and that the same species in the wild does not display these behaviors. The stereotypic pacing, the self-directed aggression, the abnormal social interactions, the chronic health problems that require constant veterinary intervention, these are not features of orca life in the ocean. They are features of orca life in a tank. The most parsimonious interpretation of this difference is that the tank produces them and the ocean does not, and that the difference between the tank and the ocean is the relevant causal factor. Applying a more complex interpretation, one that attributes the difference to genetic predisposition or individual pathology rather than environmental conditions, requires ignoring the pattern across dozens of individuals in facilities around the world over decades, a pattern that is too consistent and too widespread to be adequately explained by anything other than the conditions the animals share, which is the captivity itself. The lifespan data for captive orcas compared to wild orcas is stark. Wild female orcas have a median lifespan of around 50 years and can live past 100. Wild male orcas have a median lifespan of around 30 years. Captive orcas of both sexes have a median survival time after capture or birth of substantially less than 10 years. And the data from facilities with the longest records shows no improvement in survival rates over time, despite improvements in veterinary care and husbandry. The captive environment is lethal to the animal at a rate that the best available medical intervention has not been able to substantially alter, because the lethality is not primarily a medical problem. It is an environmental one. The animals are dying not from diseases that medicine can treat, but from the cumulative physiological and psychological costs of living in conditions that are incompatible with what they are. The aggression that captive orcas direct toward human trainers is documented extensively and is one of the dimensions of the captivity story that the marine park industry worked hardest to manage publicly. The incidents range from trainers being grabbed, dragged underwater and held there, to trainers being rammed, bitten, and in at least 3 documented cases killed. The industry described these incidents as accidents, as play behaviors that went wrong, as the result of trainer error. The researchers who studied captive orca behavior described them differently. They described them as the predictable output of a cognitively sophisticated animal under chronic stress, in a social environment it cannot navigate, directed at the nearest available target for that stress. The orca in the wild directs its aggression at prey, and, in some circumstances, at other orcas that have violated its social norms. In captivity, the prey is not there. The other orcas cannot be safely engaged with, and the trainer is what is present. The aggression is not aberrant, it is the normal behavior of a normal orca, expressed in an abnormal environment. Tilikum was an orca captured off the coast of Iceland in 1983 at approximately 2 years of age. He was placed first in a facility in Canada where he was housed with 2 adult female orcas from a different population, animals whose calls he could not understand and whose social rules he had not been raised in. The social environment he spent his first years of captivity in was one of consistent low-level aggression directed at him by the adult females, documented by trainers who noted that he was frequently raked by the other animals' teeth and that he spent significant time attempting to avoid contact with them in a tank that did not provide enough space to avoid anything reliably. He was eventually transferred to SeaWorld Orlando, where he spent the next 3 decades. Over those decades, he was involved in the deaths of 3 people. The incidents were different in their circumstances. The pattern they expressed was not. What Tilikum's story illustrates, and what the documentary record of captive orcas more broadly illustrates, is not that orcas are dangerous in the way that we sometimes mean when we say an animal is dangerous as a reflexive threat to anyone nearby. It is that an orca in captivity is an animal whose social needs, cognitive needs, and physical needs are not being met, and that the unmet needs do not disappear. They accumulate. They express themselves in the behaviors available to the animal given the constraints of the environment. And for an animal of this size, this intelligence and this social complexity, what those expressions look like when they finally arrive is not small. The breeding practices of marine parks added another dimension to the captivity story that took years to fully emerge. Tilikum was used as a breeding male throughout his time at SeaWorld, fathering 21 calves, the majority of whom are still alive in captivity. His genes now represent approximately 54% of the captive orca gene pool. The breeding decisions were made without regard for the behavioral and social traditions that shape orca development in the wild, because in captivity, there are no behavioral and social traditions to transmit. The calves born to captive mothers learn captive behaviors from captive mothers in captive environments. They learn nothing of the cultural knowledge that wild orca calves spend years absorbing from the experienced animals in their matrilineal groups. What they know of being an orca is what the tank has taught them, which is not what an orca is. The post-reproductive female orcas, whose value to wild populations we established in the previous 2 parts, simply do not exist in captivity in the same sense that they exist in the wild, because the value they carry is experiential, built from decades of ranging across an ocean and accumulating information about it. A captive female who has lived for 40 years in a tank has not accumulated that information. She has accumulated information about the tank. The tanks are all the same. The wisdom that makes an old wild female the most valuable member of her group cannot be generated in captivity because the conditions that generate it are not there. The story of captive orcas is not primarily about individual acts of violence, though those acts are real and their consequences were severe for the people involved. It is about what happens when you take an animal shaped by millions of years of evolution to inhabit one of the most cognitively demanding environments on Earth, an environment that requires constant movement, constant novel sensory experience, constant social engagement with a familiar and culturally rich group across a lifetime, and you place it in a concrete tank. What happens is not a mystery. It is what you would predict would happen to any sufficiently intelligent, sufficiently social animal, placed in a context that cannot meet its needs. The animal does not adapt cleanly. It suffers in ways that are visible to anyone willing to look at the behavioral record without looking away. SeaWorld announced in 2016 that it would end its theatrical orca shows and phase out its captive breeding program. The announcement was made in the context of declining attendance and significant public pressure, following years of scrutiny. It was not accompanied by a commitment to retire the existing animals to sea pens or to natural environments, because the animals currently in captivity are assessed by the industry as unable to survive in the wild, a condition that the captivity itself produced. They were taken from an environment they could have survived in. They were placed in one that compromised their health and their behavioral capabilities to the degree that they can no longer return to what they came from. The captivity was both the cause of the problem and the reason the problem cannot be reversed. The final part of this series will bring together everything the previous 3 parts have described and will sit with what the orca actually is when you see it whole. Not just the hunter, not just the victim of captivity, not just the culturally sophisticated social animal, but all of it at once, the full picture of what evolution has produced in this animal, and what that means for how we think about the ocean, about intelligence, and about the line between what we consider natural and what we have made. The documentary Blackfish, released in 2013, brought the captive orca story to a public audience that was large enough to change the commercial trajectory of the marine park industry in measurable ways. SeaWorld's attendance declined significantly in the years following its release. Sponsors withdrew. The company's stock price fell. The film did not discover new facts about captive orcas. It assembled existing facts, documented by researchers and former trainers, into a narrative that was accessible enough and compelling enough to reach people who had not been following the scientific literature. The response to the film demonstrated something about the relationship between the public and these animals, that people, when they understood what the captivity actually entailed, did not want to be part of it. The commercial model that had sustained the captive display industry for 50 years depended on a public that did not know what it was paying for. Once the information was available in a form that reached them, a significant portion of that public changed its behavior. The males without mothers that the first part of this series identified as a particular category of vulnerability in wild orca populations represent a version of the captivity problem that occurs in the wild. A wild male orca whose mother has died loses his primary social anchor, his preferential access to food, and the relationship whose presence has been shown to substantially improve his survival odds. Researchers tracking the southern resident population found that males whose mothers had died were significantly more likely to die within the following year than males whose mothers were still alive, and that this effect was present regardless of the male's age, including males in their 30s and 40s who had been feeding themselves successfully for decades. What the mother provides to an adult male is not primarily food acquisition assistance, though that is part of it. It is social belonging, the anchor in a matrilineal structure whose absence leaves the male without the social context that orca psychology is organized around. The motherless male in the wild is not in a tank, but something of what he experiences when the mother is gone. The removal of the social environment he was shaped to inhabit is structurally similar to what captivity imposes. and the outcome in terms of survival is structurally similar too. The orca's relationship to its own group's calls and its inability to communicate effectively with orcas from different dialect groups produces a specific kind of isolation in mixed population captive tanks that has no parallel in any other captive animal situation. When you place two orcas from different ecotypes in the same tank, you are not placing two animals from the same species in proximity. You are placing two animals from effectively different cultures in proximity, animals that cannot communicate with each other in the primary modality through which orca social life is conducted. The social stress that results is not equivalent to two humans from different countries placed in the same room. It is closer to placing two humans in the same room and removing the capacity for either of them to communicate in any language the other can understand for the rest of their lives, in a space too small to avoid contact. The aggression that results is not mysterious. It is the predictable output of that situation applied to animals with the cognitive and physical capabilities of orcas. The conservation implications of the captive orca industry extend beyond the individual animals in tanks. The southern resident population, whose decline was accelerated by the capture operations of the 1960s and 1970s, is now at a population size where genetic diversity, social structure, and the transmission of cultural knowledge are all under pressure simultaneously. A population of 75 individuals with a slow reproductive rate and a high dependence on a single prey species that is itself in decline is a population whose margin for additional stresses is very small. The cultural knowledge held by the oldest females in the population, the knowledge of historical salmon run locations and alternative foraging strategies that their experience across decades has built, is irreplaceable if those individuals die without transmitting it. The cultural erosion that occurs when a small population loses its oldest members is a form of extinction that does not show up in the head count, but that is real and consequential. The knowledge dies with the animal that held it, and the group that survives is less capable than the group that existed before. What the captivity story and the wild population story share, when you look at them together, is a common thread about what happens when the conditions that orca intelligence requires are not present. In captivity, those conditions are structurally absent, replaced by a concrete tank, incompatible social companions, and a sensory environment that the orca's perceptual system cannot adapt to. In wild populations under pressure, those conditions are being eroded progressively, the prey base shrinking, the range fragmenting, the oldest knowledge holders dying without adequate populations of young animals to transmit to. The intelligence that makes orcas what they are is not self-sustaining in the abstract. It requires the world that produced it, the ocean, the pod, the matrilineal structure, the cultural continuity, the prey, the space. Remove those conditions and the intelligence does not simply persist in a degraded form. It begins to fail in the ways we have described, at the individual level in captivity and at the population level in the wild. The next part brings this all together and tries to say honestly what it means that the ocean's most intelligent predator is also one of its most vulnerable. The pharmacological records from SeaWorld and other facilities, made available through legal discovery processes in the years following Blackfish, documented the range of medications administered to captive orcas to manage the symptoms of the conditions the captivity produced. Psychoactive drugs were used to manage aggression between incompatible animals. Antacids were used to manage the stomach ulcers that developed in animals under chronic stress. Antibiotics were used continuously to manage the infections that proliferated in animals whose immune systems were compromised by those same stressors. The drug records are not evidence of negligence or cruelty in the conventional sense. The animals were receiving the best veterinary care available. The drug records are evidence of what the captivity produced that required management, a picture of the specific ways in which the bodies of animals being held in conditions incompatible with their needs broke down, and of the pharmaceutical intervention required to keep those animals alive long enough to perform. The human beings who worked with captive orcas, the trainers who built relationships with individual animals across years of daily contact, occupy a complicated position in this story. Many of them genuinely loved the animals they worked with and believed, at least initially, that what they were doing was beneficial. The trainers who were injured or killed were not careless people who had failed to take the risks seriously. They were experienced professionals who had built the kind of trust with individual animals that makes the relationship feel real, which it was, and safe, which it was not. The orca that killed a trainer it had worked with for years was not betraying a relationship. It was expressing, through the only medium available to it in the context of a tank, the accumulated consequences of a situation that the relationship between trainer and animal could not resolve, and that the relationship, however genuine, was not designed to address. The trainer was not the cause of the problem. The trainer was the nearest available expression of its effects. The night that Tilikum died in January 2017, after 33 years in captivity, the SeaWorld statement described him as one of the most influential orcas in history. The statement was accurate in a way that was not entirely intended. He was influential because the circumstances of his life, the capture, the tank, the aggression, the deaths, the documentary, the public response, and eventually the policy change that his story helped produce, made the captive orca industry something that the public saw clearly for the first time. What the public saw when it looked was not a conservation success or an educational program. It was 33 years of what happens to an animal built for the open ocean when you put it in a concrete tank and ask it to perform. The influence was the story, and the story was what the captivity made of an animal that was, in the ocean it came from, something that nothing in the natural world has been able to match. The sea pen proposal, which has circulated in conservation and animal welfare circles since before Tilikum's death, would involve transferring captive orcas to large netted enclosures in coastal waters where they could experience something closer to the sensory environment of the ocean, hear wild orcas passing, feel tidal currents, hunt live fish, and potentially make social contact with wild animals through the net boundary. The proposal has been resisted by the facilities holding orcas on grounds ranging from cost to the argument that the animals are too compromised to survive the transition. The resistance is not entirely dishonest. The animals currently in captivity are genuinely compromised by the decades in tanks, and the transition would carry real risks. But the resistance also reflects the economic reality that the orcas are the facility's primary revenue asset, and that moving them to sea pens, even with public access, changes the nature of the product being sold in ways the facilities have not chosen to accept. The sea pen remains a proposal, the tanks remain full, the animals in them continue to be what the tanks have made them, which is not what they were, and not what they would have been. The question underneath all three previous parts has been a simple one, even if the answer required 4 parts to build properly. What is the orca when you see it whole? Not just the predator, not just the captive animal, not just the socially complex matrilineal culture, but all of it at once. The complete picture of what evolution has produced in this animal across 10 to 15 million years of continuous refinement at the top of the ocean's food chain. The answer, when you see it clearly, is this. The orca is the most successful, large predator that has ever existed on Earth. Not the most powerful in absolute physical terms, not the most fearsome in popular imagination, the most successful in the sense that matters most in evolutionary biology. The one that has achieved and maintained the top position in the most diverse range of environments against the most varied range of prey, using a strategy that has proven adaptive enough to work from the tropics to the poles and in every ocean on the planet. No other predator in the history of life on Earth has managed this. The great white shark is formidable in specific environments and flees from the orca. The sperm whale is enormous and is killed by orca groups that have worked out how to do it. The polar bear, which holds the top position on land in the Arctic, does not hold it in the water beside the ice where the orca does. The orca has no apex predator. It never has. In the history of the ocean, nothing has figured out how to be at the top of the orca. Subscribe before we close if you have not already. Drop a comment right now telling us where you are in the world and what time it is there. The comments on this series have been extraordinary, and we read every single one. The reason for this success is not physical dominance in any simple sense. An adult male orca is large, but there are larger animals in the ocean. It is fast, but there are faster fish. Its jaws are formidable, but the bite force of a large sperm whale or a great white shark is comparable or greater. What the orca has that nothing else in the ocean has to the same degree is the combination of intelligence, cultural transmission, and social coordination. Her cognitive architecture that produces locally appropriate solutions to the problem of apex predation, and then preserves and refines those solutions across generations through the mechanism of cultural learning. The orca does not just adapt biologically over evolutionary time. It adapts culturally over generational time. The solution that works in Antarctic waters is transmitted to the next generation in Antarctic waters. The solution that works in the Norwegian Sea is transmitted to the next generation in the Norwegian Sea. The solutions accumulate, improve, and diversify across populations, while the underlying cognitive architecture that generates them remains constant. This is what intelligence in service of survival looks like when it is given enough time to develop fully. The cultural diversity of orca populations is worth emphasizing one more time before we close, because it is the feature that most distinguishes the orca from every other large predator, and that most clearly explains the scope of its success. The resident orcas of the Northeast Pacific and the transient orcas of the same region are genetically close, share the same waters, and have been observed in the same locations within hours of each other. They do not interact socially. They do not share food. They do not share calls. They have been separated by their different dietary traditions for long enough, some researchers estimate 200,000 years or more, to have developed distinct physical characteristics in addition to their distinct behaviors. 200,000 years of cultural divergence within a single species, maintained by tradition rather than by geography, is something that has no parallel in the non-human animal world outside of one species, which is our own. The comparison is not metaphorical, it is structural. The orca and the human being are the only species on Earth known to have maintained culturally distinct populations in the same geographic range across evolutionary time. The brain that makes all of this possible is worth returning to in this final part, because the first part introduced it, and the intervening parts have been illustrating what it produces without always connecting back to the architecture that produces it. The paralimbic lobe, that region of the orca brain that is more elaborated than in any other animal, including humans, is the structure that appears to be responsible for the depth and complexity of orca social and emotional life. It is the neural substrate for the bonds that hold matrilineal groups together across decades. It is the structure that is engaged when an orca recognizes the call of a family member it has not heard for years. It is what is compromised when a captive orca is placed in an environment where the social bonds the lobe is built to process cannot form and cannot be maintained. The paralimbic lobe is the orca's emotional intelligence in the most literal neurological sense, and what it has produced in orca life, the long friendships, the mother-son bonds that last until one of them dies, the grief that researchers observe after a loss, the community organization that allows accumulated knowledge to pass from one generation to the next, is the most complex social and emotional life of any non-human animal in the ocean. The specific way that orca intelligence differs from human intelligence is worth examining carefully in this final part, because the comparison is tempting and the temptation can mislead. Orca intelligence is not inferior human intelligence. It is a different kind of cognitive system, shaped by different evolutionary pressures, optimized for different problems, and expressed in a different sensory world. The orca does not have the kind of abstract reasoning that allows humans to do mathematics, or to build technologies that exist independently of the body that uses them. It does not have language in the human sense, a system of arbitrary symbols with combinatorial rules that can generate an infinite range of meanings. What it has is something that in some dimensions exceeds what the human cognitive system produces. An acoustic processing system of extraordinary power. A social intelligence calibrated to relationships, maintained across decades. A cultural transmission system that has been running continuously for longer than human civilization has existed. And an emotional depth whose neurological substrate is more elaborated in the orca than in us. The comparison is not a hierarchy. It is a description of two different answers to the question of what a large-brained social animal does with its cognitive resources when those resources are pointed at the specific problems of its life. The acoustic world that orcas inhabit is so different from the visual world that humans primarily occupy that it requires a genuine effort of imagination to approach it. The ocean below the photic zone, the region that sunlight penetrates, is effectively opaque to vision. In deep water, an orca navigating by sight is essentially navigating blind. The echolocation system that replaces vision in this environment generates a sonic image of the world that is, in the dimensions it covers, richer than what vision provides in an equivalent space. An orca can detect the difference between objects of similar size but different density at distances where a human eye, even in good light, could not distinguish the objects at all. It can detect the direction, speed, and rotational movement of a prey animal. It can detect the internal structure of a fish, the gas bladder whose echo signature distinguishes one species from another, with a resolution that no human-built sonar system has yet matched. This is the primary sensory modality of an animal that has been refining it for 15 million years. What the orca experiences as the world around it, processed through this system, is not a diminished version of what we experience. It is something else entirely, richer in some dimensions and absent in others, and built from the ground up for the specific work of being an orca in the ocean. The relationship between the orca's intelligence and its position at the top of the food chain is not accidental, but it is not simply a matter of intelligence allowing the orca to outcompete other predators in direct competition. It is more subtle than that. The intelligence allows the orca to occupy multiple ecological niches simultaneously through cultural specialization. Different orca populations eat different things and have developed techniques for eating those things that exclude other predators by being too sophisticated for those predators to match. The great white shark cannot do what the wave-washing orcas do. The sperm whale cannot do what the carousel-feeding orcas do. The polar bear cannot do what the beaching orcas do. Each specialized orca population has carved out a predatory niche that its intelligence has made inaccessible to competitors, and the sum of all these niches is the global apex position that the species as a whole occupies. Intelligence, in the orca's case, is not just a tool for solving individual problems. It is the mechanism by which the species has diversified into every available predatory role in every ocean on Earth. The question of whether orcas are conscious in the way that we are conscious is one that the science approaches very carefully and that philosophy handles without resolution. What can be said with confidence because the behavioral record supports it and the neurological record is consistent with it is that something is happening inside an orca that goes beyond the mechanical processing of stimuli and responses. An animal that grieves, that plays for the sake of play, that maintains friendships across decades, that transmits cultural knowledge to the next generation through something that looks like deliberate teaching, that recognizes itself in a mirror, that produces behavior that adapts to new circumstances at a rate that cannot be explained by genetic change, is an animal whose inner life, whatever it is exactly, is not empty. The content of that inner life, the specific textures of what it is like to be an orca moving through the dark water, at 50 kilometers per hour in the company of animals it has known since birth, is not something we can access directly. But the behavioral evidence of its existence is there, in the record accumulated across 5 decades of careful field research, and it is not small. The longevity of the matriarch and its consequences for the group deserve one more treatment here, because the data that has emerged on this question in recent years is among the most striking in the orca literature. The study that compared the salmon-finding success of orca groups led by post-reproductive matriarchs versus groups led by younger animals found a difference that was largest during years of low salmon abundance, the years when the knowledge of alternative locations and historical run patterns mattered most. During years of salmon abundance, the difference was smaller because the salmon were easier to find and the accumulated knowledge of the matriarch was less necessary. The matriarch is most valuable precisely when conditions are hardest, when what the group needs most is experience with conditions it has not encountered recently. This is a striking pattern. It says that the value of accumulated knowledge in this species scales with the severity of the challenge, that the cognitive resource the old female represents is most critical exactly when the group is most at risk. The system has been shaped by evolution to store knowledge in the oldest animals and to draw on it under stress, and the system works. What happens when those animals are gone, either through natural mortality or through the mortality that pollution and prey scarcity accelerate, is that the system has nothing to draw on. The group faces hard years without the hard year knowledge, and it shows in the survival data. The orca's relationship with time is one of its most unusual features, and one of the hardest to communicate because it has no parallel in the life of any other ocean animal. An animal that can live for 100 years, that remembers the individuals it has known across decades, that carries the locations and the behavioral patterns of prey across seasonal and multi-year cycles, is an animal whose relationship to time extends in both directions, further than any ocean predator other than the sperm whale, which also lives for decades and also accumulates knowledge across years. But the sperm whale does not have the orca's cultural transmission system. It does not pass its knowledge to the next generation in the organized, systematic way that the orca matriarch passes her knowledge to the animals who follow her. The knowledge in a sperm whale dies with the sperm whale. The knowledge in an orca matriarch passes to her daughters, who pass it to theirs. Time is not just something the orca experiences, it is something the orca uses, accumulating across individual lifetimes, and transmitting across generations in a way that compounds over the centuries that a stable orca community has occupied a given stretch of ocean. The species that share the ocean with orcas have, over the time that orcas have been the apex predator of those oceans, evolved responses to orca predation that are visible in the behavioral record of those species today. The grey whale, which orcas prey on during the annual migration, has developed a behavioral repertoire for countering orca attacks that includes the use of shallow coastal waters where orca maneuverability is reduced, active defense of calves by adult cows, and the specific flight behaviors that give calves the best chance of escaping a pursuit. The humpback whale has developed the aggressive defensive behavior toward orcas that researchers have documented in detail. The charging, the shielding, the recruitment of other humpbacks to assist in the defense. The great white shark has developed the acute sensitivity to orca presence that causes it to abandon feeding grounds entirely at their arrival. These behavioral responses are the evolutionary fingerprints of living for millions of years in a world where the orca exists. The ocean has been shaped by the orca's presence in ways that extend beyond the individual interactions we can observe. The fear of the orca, encoded in the behavior of the animals that have been its prey for millions of years, is one of the most pervasive organizing forces in the structure of marine communities worldwide. The threats that wild orca populations face are the threats that most large marine animals face, compounded by the specific vulnerabilities of an animal that depends on cultural transmission and on the long-lived matriarchs who carry the knowledge the transmission depends on. Prey depletion is the most immediate threat for populations like the southern residents, whose Chinook salmon dependence makes them hostage to the salmon populations that are themselves under pressure from dams, habitat loss, and ocean warming. Noise pollution from shipping traffic interferes with the echolocation and the social communication that orca groups depend on for hunting and for maintaining cohesion, adding a continuous background of acoustic interference to the sensory environment of animals, whose primary sensory modality is acoustic. Pollution, particularly the persistent organic pollutants that accumulate in the fat of marine mammals and that are passed from mothers to calves through the rich fatty milk of nursing, concentrates in orca bodies at levels that suppress immune function and reproductive success in ways that are measurable in the population data. And the loss of the oldest females, whether through pollution, through prey scarcity, or through the mortality that any aging population faces, removes the repositories of accumulated knowledge that the group's long-term functioning depends on in ways that cannot be replaced on any useful timescale. The conservation of orca populations requires addressing all of these threats simultaneously, and the complexity of doing so reflects the complexity of the animal itself. You cannot protect the orca without protecting the salmon that the salmon-dependent populations eat, which requires removing dams, restoring river habitat, and managing hatchery operations across a political landscape involving multiple jurisdictions and multiple competing interests. You cannot protect the orca from noise pollution without reducing shipping traffic in key areas or changing ship speeds and routes in ways that have economic costs that the industry will not absorb without regulatory pressure. You cannot remove the persistent organic pollutants that have accumulated in wild orca bodies because there is no mechanism for doing that. You can only reduce future contamination by regulating the production and disposal of the chemicals that produce it, which requires the kind of regulatory effort that moves slowly against the resistance of industries that benefit from the current arrangements. The orca's fate is entangled with human decisions at every level, from what kind of ships cross what waters at what speeds to what pesticides are permitted to be manufactured. The animal at the top of the ocean's food chain is not outside human influence. It is inside it, in ways that are deep and far-reaching and not yet fully mapped. The orca that kills a blue whale is the same animal that carries its dead calf for 17 days across 1,000 miles of ocean. The orca that extracts the liver from a great white shark with surgical precision is the same animal that plays in the surf, for no reason other than the experience of the wave. The orca that passes hunting techniques to its young through patient demonstration across seasons is the same animal that collapses mentally in a concrete tank because the conditions its mind requires are not available there. These are not contradictions. They are the facets of a single animal, seen from different angles, each one real and each one necessary for the complete picture. The brutality is real, the grief is real, the intelligence is real, the vulnerability is real. The orca is all of these things simultaneously, and the full picture is more interesting and more important than any single facet of it. The specific way that the orca sits in the evolutionary tree of life is worth locating clearly, because the context changes what the four parts of this series describe. The orca's ancestors were land mammals. Around 50 million years ago, a lineage of terrestrial mammals returned to the ocean, their limbs gradually transforming into flippers over millions of years of selection, their nostrils migrating to the top of their heads, their bodies becoming streamlined by the same hydrodynamic pressures that shaped fish independently, the result of a process called convergent evolution, in which unrelated lineages arrive at similar forms because similar environments impose similar selection pressures. The whales and dolphins, including the orca, are the outcome of that return to the ocean, and they carry inside their flippers the vestigial bones of the hands that their ancestors used on land. The intelligence that the orca deploys in the ocean is not the intelligence of something that evolved in the ocean. It is the intelligence of a lineage that went back to the ocean carrying a mammalian brain, and that spent 50 million years refining that brain under the selection pressures of the ocean's most demanding predatory roles. The result is an animal that is neither fully oceanic in its cognitive architecture, like the fish and the sharks it preys on, nor fully terrestrial, like the primates and the elephants we have compared it to in other contexts. It is something in between, and the combination has produced the most successful large predator the ocean has ever contained. The four parts of this series have been building toward a picture of an animal that is, in almost every dimension that matters, exceptional. Exceptional intelligence, exceptional social complexity, exceptional cultural diversity, exceptional longevity, exceptional hunting capability, and exceptional vulnerability to the conditions that humans have created in the ocean and around it. The exceptionalism in all of these dimensions is connected. The intelligence that makes the orca the top predator of every ocean is the same intelligence that makes captivity so destructive to captive orcas. The cultural transmission that allows different populations to develop locally appropriate hunting strategies is the same mechanism that makes the loss of a single matriarch so costly to her group's long-term functioning. The longevity that allows a matriarch to accumulate decades of ecological knowledge is the same feature that means the damage done to an individual by pollution or by prey Scarcity accumulates over decades before it is fully expressed in the survival data. The orca's strengths and its vulnerabilities are the same things, seen from different angles. This is not unusual for complex, long-lived social animals. It is characteristic of them. The more sophisticated the system, the more ways it has to fail when the conditions it requires are not present. The story of the orca and the story of humanity's relationship to the ocean are entangled in ways that neither the orca nor the humans involved in that relationship fully anticipated. When the first orca was harpooned in 1964 for a sculptor's research project and survived to become the first captive display animal of her species, nobody involved was thinking about cultural transmission or the paralimbic lobe or the grandmother hypothesis. They were thinking about the size of the audience and the cost of maintaining a large marine animal and whether the commercial model would work. It worked for a while in the narrow sense. The commercial model generated revenue. It also generated, over the 50 years that followed, an accumulation of knowledge about what orcas actually are, produced partly by the scientific research that the captive animals enabled and partly by the field research that the captive industry's existence helped fund. And that accumulation of knowledge produced the situation we are now in, knowing enough about the orca to understand what captivity does to it, knowing enough to see the decline in wild populations and to understand its causes, knowing enough to say with confidence what the orca requires to be what it actually is, and not yet having made the political and economic choices that acting on that knowledge would require. What happens to orca populations over the coming decades will depend on decisions that are being made now, mostly in contexts that do not seem connected to orca welfare, but that are connected to it through the web of dependencies that links ocean health to land use, to atmospheric chemistry, to political will. The southern residents, 75 animals off the coast of Washington and British Columbia, are living the outcome of decisions made over the past century, from the dam construction that reduced salmon runs to the capture operations that reduced their numbers to the pollution that accumulated in their bodies. They are also the subjects of more active conservation attention than almost any comparably small population of animals on Earth, monitored daily by researchers who know every individual by name, who track every birth and every death, who have been documenting their decline long enough to understand its causes with a precision that makes the decisions that could reverse it, in principle, clear. Whether those decisions will be made is not a scientific question. It is a political and an economic one. The science has done its part. The orca has done its part. What remains is what we do with what we know. The researchers who have spent careers studying orcas describe a specific experience that many of them share, of being at the surface of the ocean and having an orca approach the boat and look at them from close range, the animal's eye, which is surrounded by the white oval patch that makes orca eye contact visible from a distance, holding contact for a sustained period before the animal submerges. The researchers describe this experience in similar ways: a sense of being assessed, of having a mind at work on the other side of the interaction, of being seen by something that has an opinion about what it is seeing. Whether that description is accurate in any rigorous scientific sense is debatable. Whether the experience it describes is real, whether the people who have it are responding to something genuine in the behavior of the animal, is less debatable. The orca that approaches a research boat and holds eye contact is doing something. It is not the behavior of an animal that is indifferent to human presence. It is the behavior of an animal that is interested in it, in a way that reflects the same social intelligence and the same capacity for interspecies assessment that we have documented across the full range of orca behavior in this series. The ocean that the orca occupies is approximately 360 million square kilometers of water, covering 70% of the surface of the Earth, with an average depth of nearly 4 kilometers and a total volume of approximately 1.3 billion cubic kilometers. It contains more living matter than all terrestrial ecosystems combined. It regulates the climate, drives the weather, produces more than half the oxygen in the atmosphere, and absorbs a substantial fraction of the carbon dioxide that human activity has added to it. The orca does not hold the top position in this ocean because it is the most important species in it, in any ecological sense. Many species that are invisible to casual observation are more ecologically important, more numerous, more central to the nutrient cycles that the ocean runs on. The orca is at the top in the predatory sense, the sense that nothing hunts it while it hunts everything. But the ocean is not a hierarchy of importance. It is a web of dependencies, and the orca is one thread in that web, a thread that connects to many others, and that, if it is removed, changes the web in ways that cascade outward from the point of removal. The loss of an apex predator does not leave the ecosystem unchanged. It leaves it reorganized, in ways that are sometimes subtle and sometimes not, and that almost always represent a loss of the complexity that makes the ecosystem what it is. Tonight, somewhere in the Pacific, an orca is moving through water that is dark enough to make vision irrelevant. She is navigating by sound, the clicks she produces returning from the seafloor and from the creatures around her, in a continuous acoustic portrait of everything within range. The matriarch of her group, old enough to remember salmon runs that her grandchildren have never seen, is somewhere nearby. The rest of her family is distributed through the water around her, connected by vocalizations that carry identity and location in frequencies too low for human ears to register. They have been together since before she was born. They will be together until one of them is not. The ocean around them is cold, and it is very large, and it contains more life than can be named, and they are at the top of it, as they have been for longer than our species has been on the earth to take notice. The water holds them, the dark holds them, the night goes on. Sleep well. The name killer whale, which we noted in the first part, is a mistranslation that has misled people about what kind of animal this is, carries one truth inside its inaccuracy. The orca does kill. It kills at the scale of the ocean, from the smallest salmon to the largest whale, from the shallows of a Patagonian beach to the deep water off the coast of Norway, from the ice of Antarctica to the warm surface of the tropics. The killing is real, and it is continuous, and it is what the animal was built for across 10 to 15 million years of evolutionary refinement. The name is wrong about what it is. It is not wrong about what it does. And understanding what it does, in the full context of what it is what the 4 parts of this series have been for. The killer is also the griever. The apex predator is also the matriarch's devoted son. The wave-washing hunter is also the animal carrying its dead calf across 1,000 miles of ocean because it cannot put it down. These are not separate animals. They are the same animal, seen whole. And seen whole, the orca is the most complete expression of what the ocean has produced in the time it has had to produce it, which is a very long time, and which has been enough.